Hey, welcome back to the Upper Left Show, brought to you by Multiply PDX. We're really pumped to be together today for this episode with Jonathan Martin from CoServe. Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest. Excited to see you, Jonathan. Thanks for being with us.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, and I'm joined by Ashwa Hawthorne from Brilliance Labs. Hey, Ashwa, how you doing?
What's up, Gabe? And good to see you, Jonathan. It's been a few months.
Yeah, my name is Gabe Kolstad, and I'm from Westside Community Church. And I just wanted to kind of take a second to get to know Jonathan. So, Jonathan, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, who are you? What do you do? And let us get to see a little bit of your background.
Well, first of all, I have one of the coolest jobs in the world, and that's get to work with leaders around the world, church leaders, nonprofit leaders, and traveling and getting to be with them and teaching servant leadership. And that's a term that we throw around a lot, but very few people actually understand what it means, especially in the church, tragically. But to come and change people's paradigms on what actually Jesus taught about leadership and what Paul practiced in leadership. So I get to do that, and I get to be taught by others. So that's amazing. And I guess the way that journey started is giving my life to Jesus at 17 years old, and then pretty much being involved in some kind of ministry ever since then. We moved to the Portland area right after we got married, my wife and I. She tried to get away from me in Eastern Europe for a while I ran off to East Asia, but she couldn't get away. And I finally caught up with her, and we moved to the Portland area, and then we went back overseas together to East Asia and ministered in amongst a Muslim people group for a number of years in Central Asia. And then moved back, and we were on staff at Good Shepherd Community Church out in Gresham, Oregon, for 15 years, and got to work in the global outreach department, overseeing the global outreach department, which meant I got to go visit our missionaries in, 25 different countries. So the experience of getting to be in different cultures and learn from different people and see the church in different situations has been phenomenal. It's been a huge blessing. When I came back to the United States, I came on as a pastor at Good Shepherd, and I had my idea of what a pastor was. So a pastor is somebody who builds, a ministry around his personality and his giftings, and he can make the church grow if he's gifted enough and he has big enough personality. And I figured I was gifted enough and had a big enough personality, so that was my trajectory. And when I came back, I got asked to do a retreat for another church. See, so my trajectory, it was heading in the right direction. And I asked them, hey, what do you want me to do it on? And they said, whatever you want, which is the question I hate. Give me a topic and I'll do it. And my brother had taught on the character of Jonathan, which is my namesake. And it was intriguing. So I thought, what if I taught on the character of Jonathan, his relationship with David, and I like to do these drama things. So what if I became David and told about his relationship with Jonathan? And so I did that. And in doing that, I realized it actually was life-changing for me. First of all, because of the loss at the end. He loses Jonathan. David loses Jonathan. It's an amazing friend who stuck with him against culture, against all odds, against nature. Jonathan stuck with David and not his father, Saul. But anyway, as I got into it, I realized, oh my word, my leadership style is much more like Saul's than Jonathan's. And it was so convicting. It really changed the course of my life. It changed I was scared to be like Saul, and I realized I was, and I realized that that's how I'd been trained by pastors just like Saul. And so I really, at that point in time, made a decision that I was going to do something differently. And meanwhile, there's a guy in the back of our church. His name was Marshall Christensen, who ran this organization that taught servant leadership. And I go, what's servant leadership? And he had helped start a university in Kazakhstan, and had done a bunch of stuff in different places, had been a university president himself. So I tagged along with him for some of his training. And I go, okay, this is it. This is exactly the journey I'm starting on. And I have somebody who's way ahead of me. And so that launched me in this servant leadership journey. And it happened while I was on staff at Good Shepherd. And And I think probably one of the more profound things that happened is I realized that, preaching to 2,000 people is fun and I enjoy that. But that's not nearly as important as the guy who's sitting next to me on my couch at 1 a.m, wrestling through his problems. Mm. And, not even close. And I mean that. I learned that the kingdom is small. It's like, imagine this, a mustard seed that goes into the ground. And yet we think if we can climb to the top, if I can finally have a platform to share my wisdom and my message and show off my personality that God, of course, has given me, then I can be of influence. And it's a lie. And we pursue it and we think that's where it's at because that's how we've been trained. And I think what happened to me at that moment, at that retreat, and then is suddenly I was freed from having to prove myself and having to justify my existence. And I could really serve and I could let people surpass me in my giftedness and empower them. And it was so freeing and so fun that it's just like, man, I want to teach this. I want to help other people be freed from this syndrome, as I call it, the King Saul syndrome. So that's it in a nutshell.
All right, well, this can be good. This can be fun because we are kind of coming at this at a timely time. I think. For this topic and a place in the world that sort of craves what you're talking about. Not. Mm-hmm. I don't know if the church craves it. I think the culture craves it. And I'm just very curious to hear more about you. You and Oshua, by the way, have a background and a history that I'm just kind of finding out about. So, Oshua, what do you got to say?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I don't remember where we first met. Maybe it was at one of the men's missions prayer breakfasts at Good Shepherd several years ago. But we connected, and then I was going through a master's program at Western, and I needed a mentor while I went through it. And I asked you, hey, would you take some time to mentor me? And you were kind enough to give me some of your time, and then you ran this pastoral cohort with some of the co-serve guys where we had maybe once or twice a year retreats where we got away for several days. We did that maybe 2 or 3 times, and it was all around this theme of servant leadership. And I think I would also add like maybe just brokenness in ministry and how we process that, and then how we come out the other end as healthier pastors and men of God who are humble and more like David than Saul. And you mentioned your book just in passing, and this is it. And for when we started the cohort, that's one of the assignments to read in prep for it was to go through your book, and it's called Breaking the King Saul Syndrome: The Cancerous Crown and Its Cure, Giving the Kingdom Away. And so I'm wondering, Jonathan, if you would just give us the short version of what is the King Saul syndrome, and in particular, how do I know if I have it or not?
Yeah, that is a great question. First of all, King Saul, we know he was Israel's first king, but the syndrome actually goes back before King Saul became the king. It goes back to the people of Israel. They cry out for a king. Why? Well, because everyone around them has a king. We can't function. We have to be like everyone else. And so this desire for a king, for a figurehead, for someone to be above us, someone to blame, it's in the church, someone to do our spiritual work for us. The Bible's hard to understand. I want someone to just tell me what it means, which is spiritual slothfulness, but that's what we love. We want someone to do it for us. We were just teaching through Corinthians, and the people in the church in Corinth, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. None of those were bad guys. But Paul goes after them and says, you guys are being babies. Stop it. Don't be of somebody. We need to be of Jesus. We're all together. So anyway, Saul, he starts off humble. He's chasing some donkeys. He doesn't want to be king. He's resisting it. He's hiding in the baggage. If you go back and read the story, they come out, they're going to announce him to be king, and he's hiding. He's doesn't want this position. But then the Holy Spirit, God's power comes on him. He wins this amazing battle, and saves a whole group up in the mountains. And he comes back and everybody's, wow, this is our man. And then later, in the same power of the Spirit, he goes up and he fights against the Amalekites and doesn't obey God. But he has a great victory. And then Samuel is looking for, hey, I meant to mention when he came back out of the mountains the first time, he sacrifices and builds an altar to the Lord. Thanksgiving. It's you, God. Well, later on, when he defeats the Amalekites, Samuel comes looking for him. And where is he? Oh, he's up there building a monument to himself. And you go, whoa, what happened? And then you see this guy who didn't want the crown, incapable of giving it up, unwilling. I mean, when there's an heir apparent and it's been told you, and it's like, this is the guy, God has anointed him, well, give it to him. Help him succeed. But no, what does Saul spend the rest of his life doing? Trying to kill him, keep him down. So what the King Saul syndrome is, and after I saw this story, I related it immediately to one of the man I wanted to be like as a pastor. He was one of my heroes. He came to Christ. He was a musician and a donut maker, and he came to Christ and went to seminary, and then he pastored. He grew up in the community I grew up in, and he came to pastor the church I grew up in. And everything about him I wanted to be like. He was out there in the community. He was doing amazing things. But this syndrome, he would answer the phone. Everybody in the community knew him. Pastor Dave, and it's like his identity 100% was his role. And he was like the man. He was the chief musician. He was a great musician in the church, led worship. He preached. He started Celebrate Recovery. There were people coming to faith in Christ. He was reaching out in the community. But he kept doing so much. There was a fire in the mountain, and he was the chaplain to the fire department. And he went and got socks at Walmart. And he had a bipolar snap. And when the elder said, hey, you need to take time for your family. You need to take time to really get some healing. You need to step down as pastor. He fought it, and he divided the whole church over it. And he lost his family. He lost his church. He lost everything. And I go, oh my word, this is King Saul version 2. And I was headed down the exact same path. He was my model, and it ended up in self-destruction. And he was incredibly successful. The church grew massive amounts. People were coming to Christ all over the place. But he lost that which was most important and dearest to him, and dearest to us all. And so I just go, wow, I have to recalibrate. I saw, not just with him, every time I've shared this story, and you guys can relate, you can come up with probably 5 or 6 guys this happened to. And it's tragic. So it's the people crying out for a king. They want that figurehead. They want that celebrity CEO type of leader. And then we too willingly, if we have that kind of personality, step into that role. And it happens over and over again. And people get hurt. So many people leave the church because of hurt. And usually it's hurt from the leadership. And it's leadership that quite frankly doesn't care so much about people as it does about keeping the positions of power. And I see this over and over and over. And I said, well, tell me, was it like this? And they go, yeah, how did you know? I go, well, tragically, I've been around the world a few times, and it's the same in every culture. We adopt our culture's form of leadership. We superimpose it over the top of the church, and it's not meant to be that way.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. So that's that really helpful description and definition of the King Saul syndrome. Now help us to get a glimpse and maybe a definition and some contours to this idea of biblical servant leadership. What does that look like?
Well, one of the things that you see in contrast to Saul is you see Jonathan, when he saw David, Saul was moved to jealousy and wanted to kill him. Jonathan, who was going to be the next king, everybody knew it. He was suited. The army loved him. In fact, the army sided with him in one place. The whole army sided with him instead of Saul. They loved Jonathan. He loved God. He was going to be, and when he saw what God was doing in David, it says, instead of being moved to jealousy, he was moved to love David as himself, which is just profound. Every human being gets moved to jealousy when somebody is supplanting them and their power. You read in history of people who kill for the crown. I was just reading Alexander the Great. His best friends, one guy who saved him right at the end by chopping off the guy who was going to kill his arm, Alexander the Great had killed, murdered, because he was a threat to his power. And it's all over the place. And we see it in the church. We see people who, pastors who don't let this guy preach because, quite frankly, he's good. It's like, what in the heck is that about? It's like we should be empowering the people in their giftedness around us, just like Jonathan did. And it wasn't just Jonathan. Next time we see John in the Bible, it's John the Baptist. And he goes, hey, he must increase. I must decrease. Then Jesus himself says, man, greater works that you're going to do than I do. It's to your advantage that I go away because I'll send the helper and then you're going to do what you're called to do. It's like Jesus knew that physically for him to get out of the picture would allow them to grow up. So this empowerment. And when I really describe Christian leadership, that's what Paul did. He empowered. He never kept climbing up. He would go in, he would lead, he would hand over, he would push up and say, bye-bye, I've done my job. So he was modeling the same kind of thing. And I have this little hand motion gospel I teach all over the world. So it's like God created us for this relationship. We broke that relationship. What we couldn't do, God did by what? Coming down, crossing all barriers. And coming down, dying on our behalf, he offers us what he did for us in exchange for our sin. And we grab a hold of that and he lifts us back up into that relationship. So it's a real easy picture. Well, that's not the gospel. God created us for relationship. That's not the gospel. That's the bad news. We broke it. The gospel is what God did by what? Coming down. And he went from the highest place imaginable, God. If you try to imagine something greater, you just get a better vision of who God is. And he came down to live a human life, not just a human life, a poor human life in a time in history where there was no modern medicine, started off life as a refugee, and it just kept going down from there. He died the worst kind of possible death, humanly speaking, a criminal's death on a cross, judged guilty by 2 different courts. And so then he's on this cross. Well, can it get any worse? Naked with the very tongues he created mocking him. Can it get worse? Can he go lower? Yes. How about taking all the sins of mankind upon himself? So you have the one who's in the highest position imaginable. And what did he do with that position? He gave it up to take the lowest place. Why? To see us lifted up, to see us become all that we can be. And we see the same with Paul. Paul's vision was not to leave people babies, to leave them immature. He says, to this end, I labor and strive with everything within me to present every man complete in Christ. That means realizing their fullest potential, their fullest giftedness, making sure that he's put that into them and that he has not gotten in the way. So servant leadership, generally the leaders all around the world, wherever I go, it's tragic, but they tend to climb up on top and keep everybody down and below them. And servant leadership is that seed that goes into the ground that pushes everything up and beyond itself, that bears much fruit. And it's not an optional, I should say, it's not like, well, it's an alternate form of leadership. It actually is the Bible. You go and look at the Bible, you can't get around it. Everywhere we see this. And we see it. This is the way it should be in the church. They should model it. Elders should model it. Elder teams should model it. And then it should be that way in the places of work run by Christians. And it should be that way in the home. Men should be sacrificing to make sure their kids and their wives become everything that they're meant to be. So the problem is we don't see that. And yet when we do, there's great joy and there's community and there's people love being there. They find a sense of, wow, we're helping each other to grow, and we're really, the body is building itself up in love.
Yeah, that's really powerful, Jonathan. And you mentioned about business and home and church, and how this Christ-like leadership looks in these different spheres. Something that stands out to me from the cohort that we did, where it was largely church leaders, right? But several of the folks that helped lead CoServe actually have a business background, and have applied these servant leadership principles in business really effectively. And one thing that struck me as we were gathering with these pastors is we were trying to talk about stories of servant leadership in the ministry, where they've experienced, like as they were maybe being discipled and raised up, how they experienced servant leadership. And there was surprisingly few stories and actual experiences of servant leadership. In fact, there was far more stories of the Saul kind of experience. And so why is it? What is it about the American church industrial complex? Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. But what is it about the church that breeds more Sauls than Jonathans? What are we working with that is kind of creating the results that we're getting?
Well, I think the structures of the church itself. Okay. And what I mean by that, just think of how the church is built. Where does the preacher preach? It used to be the pulpit, and the pulpit was the center of the gathering. Well, we don't even use the word anymore. Pulpit, by the way, you don't find in the Bible. You don't find the word pulpit in the Bible, surprisingly enough. Well, you certainly don't find the word stage, but that's how it's built. Now we're on the stage. And you think about that. That's rather interesting. The platform, the stage. So one guy gets that. And so our structures in themselves are encouraging the cream of the crop to rise above the rest. And so the structures attract the wrong kind of person quite often. So that's the starting point is there are structures. It's like, in our culture, if you want to be king over your own little kingdom, where is the best place to go? Well, the thing that resembles a little kingdom the most is a church, maybe a country church. You have your throne or your pulpit, your stage, that you send every week, and you tell people how to live, and people actually listen to you, and they go do the things you say. Unlike even the president of the United States, nobody listens to him. Nobody does the things he says, but they do the pastor because he's a religious leader. So we have these structures where one person is the spiritual light or guru in a building for these people. So it attracts the wrong kind of person. And then even the right kind of person, it does something to us to achieve the accolades and the praise of men every Sunday, and if it's saying, hey, that was so wonderful. I could never have understood the Bible had you not explained it to me. It's like, that's not true, by the way. They could have, but that's so flattering. It's like, well, let's keep teaching it that way then, and make you dependent upon me. So and then we start believing that we're really needed in the kingdom of God, that we are the ones, God's chosen one to teach his word and to be this. And we fiercely guard that pulpit. Stu Weber, when he was in seminary, he had a guy come and tell him, it was one of his profs. He said, fiercely guard the pulpit because that's your, basically your throne. By somebody in seminary. It's like, that's your dome. No, it's like, let's raise up 10 people that preach better than me. Which is better, that I stay on the throne the whole time, or I raise up 10 people who are better than me, who are going to raise up 10 that are better than them? And that's the biblical model. But the structures produce this person who starts thinking he's something when he's nothing, who starts building a monument to himself rather than attributing it to God. And there was a church up in a denomination. They did some research, psychological research up in Canada, Presbyterian, small denomination. 1 out of 3 of the pastors up there has narcissistic personality disorder. And a disorder is usually something you carry with you from a childhood. So it shows that it was attracting the wrong kind of person. But then again, the bigger the church is, the more narcissistic they are. So it shows it's also corrupting the people. So that's why giving the power away is so important, because if we hold on to it, if we take the ring of power and put it on our finger, it will corrupt us. Tolkien got it. We have to give it to the little guy. We have to constantly be giving the kingdom away. And it saves, and it's joyful. It's suddenly there's joy instead of, I have to prove myself. I have to keep my kingdom. I have to control people. No, I get to watch them shine. I get to watch them develop. I get to watch them out preach me. My son recently, has done some things where he's broken my running records, and it's like, that's what you want your son to do. I joke that I don't, but it's like, no, you want your son to surpass you, just like Paul called Timothy his children. They wanted Timothy his son, and in Silvanus and all these guys, they were his sons, and he wanted them to outdo him in every way, just like Jesus wanted his disciples truly to be more fruitful even than he was. So so anyway, the structures really, they entice us. They allow us to pursue things that are not good for us, and we don't realize it. We think we can wield the ring of power, and we can't.
I would love to press on that for a minute, Jonathan, because especially Oshawa, after your comment that you're looking at the church world versus the business world, and it almost seems like the business world sometimes is more interested in servant leadership than the church is. But the business world has equal power structures, if not more, because you could throw money in there and then it really becomes, an enticing thing. Why would it be that the business world seems more ready to move into servant leadership than the church when power structure is, what do you think? What else do you think might be at play that's changing that? Because like the stage, I agree, the stage can be intoxicating. But so could so many pieces of leverage that a business leader has.
Yeah. I have a theory on that, but you are right. Many business leaders do have the King Saul syndrome, just period. Okay. So that happens there. But why do some Christian businessmen actually practice servant leadership more readily than pastors, which I see? Yeah. And I do have a theory for that. One is business is not rooted as much in tradition and doing things the way people have done them for generations, as is the church. Yeah. Business goes, what can make me a profit? And a good leader is going to go, what's going to create community, going to create cohesiveness? What's going to go ahead? And they want to do something that actually works. And servant leadership in the business world really, really works. One of our mentors was an apple orchard in Eastern Washington that became the biggest privately owned apple orchard in the world, 1 billion apples a year, and the way they practiced it, I go, this is the best church I've ever seen. And it's not even a church. It's a business. The way they loved their Hispanic workers, the way they poured into them, the way they empowered them, the way kids that were born there became teacher of the year later on and medical doctors, and they got behind their, it's like, whoa. People would leave and start their own orchards and become their competitors, and they would just clap and praise it because that's what we're raising these people to be, everything they're meant to be. And I go, why doesn't the church do that? And it's a great question, but I do think we follow this traditional way of doing things. I never questioned, the singular pastor model ever, because that's what I grew up seeing. And then you have somebody go, well, who is the pastor in, Corinth? I can't find him. Who is the pastor in this church, Ephesus? I can't find him. It's there, but it's so clearly that's the way we work. And so anyway, that's one of my theories, but it really does work. Servant leadership as it's been practiced, and people are starting to see that. So even people who aren't believers are applying the principles of Jesus to their place of work and saying, we will love and empower our people and help them become, instead of trying to control and keep them down and confine them. Let's see what God really has for them. So,
well, we've got a couple more questions for you, Jonathan. I mean, I think one question I almost threw out was, do you think that I should tear out the stage in my church?
That's a great question. So, because I mean, our church has a stage.
Yeah.
And I preach and I go up on the stage. Okay. So we haven't torn it out yet. But we have to realize that how fiercely do I guard my position on that stage? How readily am I sharing these plays? How readily am I bringing people up and interviewing what God's doing and somebody who has a business that's servant leadership led? How well am I doing at really handing the kingdom to the people? So there are these structures that are working against us and, at least working to turn us into a King Saul. So we have to be aware of it. Okay. The other question is, how do you know you're a King Saul? Well, just assume you are and do everything you can not to be, because I was headed that path. It's human nature. And so I think the assumption is, on my own devices and my own way of doing things and doing things in the flesh, I will become a King Saul. I will try to control people. I will be threatened by other people. But when we start giving things away and start really, then there's a joy that comes in and go, I don't want to go back. I can't go back. Yeah. That's what I've experienced.
So we've all seen like the misuse of power in the world, but also I know all of us have in the church. Yeah. Can you talk though on the flip side of how have you personally seen servant leadership come in and make a difference and transform a situation and encourage a church in your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question, because when we first brought this cohort together, where have you seen this? Nobody had an answer, but everybody had been hurt by King Saul, so they know I don't want to be the same person perpetrating the hurt. Well, that's what will happen. We will become that person because that's the model we've learned. So as we talk through together, I can tell you from that cohort, about 10 guys or so, everyone has a story and it's very different. Like Ash ended up closing down a church and seeing something else born out of it. And he did so very much with the servant leadership mentality, mindset. And to watch that's nothing I would have anticipated or prayed for or wanted to see happen. But the way he did it was beautiful. And then another guy, I could go on. Another guy had to leave his ministry up in Alaska because his wife was not doing well. She was just the depression, the darkness, and he loved it. He's Alaskan. And to watch him not only save his marriage, but God bless him as he said, I'm going to take care of my bride. It was like, that was a piece that, again, I didn't end. And leaving the church, he'd set it up in a way that it was run by a team and he could actually step out and he didn't leave a huge gapping hole that caused everything to collapse. But one of my favorite stories is I'm actually get to be involved with it. A guy that was introduced to the servant leadership stuff. He had been hurt by the King Saulish type of stuff and came out, and there was a church split in our community here in Sisters 11, 12 years ago. And it was nasty. Small community, church split, the evangelical church, and everybody hates each other. Wonderful example of Jesus. And, but we know how that happens. And so the church split, and then my friend Ryan, who was in the cohort with us, ended up being asked to pastor the group that left. And he wasn't part of the split, but he was pastoring this church for years and years. Well, when, he went through the servant leadership training. And so one of his commitments was always to work with the other churches in the community. It's not a competition. We are building the kingdom together. How can we work together? So he reached out to the other pastors. He built really good relationships with all of them. And when COVID happened, we couldn't meet. Our church, called Vast at the time, couldn't meet in the public schools anymore. We had no place to meet. So we ended up, we went back to the church they split out from. Hey, could we meet in your church on Sunday nights? Or on Saturday nights? Because, oh, sure, come in and meet, because of the relationship he built with the pastor. Now, some people who had some hurt feelings had to deal with that. But then, out of the blue, why don't we come back together and be one church? So I have, in my whole life, I've never heard of a church split coming back together. I'm sure it's happened.
Not either. Wow.
I've not heard of it. I've heard of church mergers, and they don't usually go well. So a church split and then remerging, this is a recipe for disaster, unless God is in this. And I remember telling Ryan, I said, Ryan, it takes one person who has to have his own way, and one elder from either their side or our side, and this won't work. And so when we came back together, the attitude of service and learning from one another, it was interesting. The pastor at the other church, before we came back together, the last week in his congregation, he had me come in and preach on the King Saul syndrome, because their church had a tendency to want the big, powerful leader, and that had happened to them. They actually at one point said, "We have hired the Michael Jordan of pastors." That didn't go well. Okay, you can guess. So that was during the time of the split. Well, they learned some of their lessons, and they were ready and humble and teachable. And here's one thing I learned from C.J. Coffey. He talked about his elders not being a decision-making group, but a band of brothers. And servant leadership basically says we have to, at the core, the lead team has to be the community we're asking others to be. And if we're not, let's just pack up our bags and go home. Because servant leadership is modeling. Imagine if we had a president of the United States that actually modeled character. I mean, that would be amazing. So, but in the church, we have people who are gifted, who are eloquent, but not necessarily modeling at all. And that's a real problem. So the modeling of us elders, we got together, we went on a team retreat, we heard each other's stories, we've gotten into each other's life. Yesterday, I was in the restaurant with this combined team of folks. There is so much joy on that team. There is confession of sin. We are truly learning to model the community that we're asking others to be. And I think that I can't get over. I mean, Ryan says in all of his years of ministry, he's never had such joy or health. I feel the same way. I've never been on a team where there's so much help. We can talk about the hard issues. We can go after each other and still love each other. We can laugh like mad with each other. There's a health. It was really Ryan in his determination, and it took him 7 or 8. That's the thing, is once you decide to be a servant leader in a church, it will not happen overnight. There's a whole group of people that are expecting something different. So it's a long toil in the same direction, and you're going to meet resistance. You can bet it. But Ryan yesterday said, he's been in ministry for 20 years, over 20 years. This is the most joy-filled, the greatest time in ministry I've ever had. And I really think that there are going to be hardships. There are every day. But when you have a team that can weather it together and is committed to being together and bearing the weight together and loving one another and enjoying one another and speaking the truth in love together, it's been a beautiful thing. So I'm amazed that it took place and that it's healthy. I mean, extremely healthy in my experience.
Yeah. And I'll bet have you guys had any community reaction to that? Is there anybody else in the community that's kind of surprised that something like that could work?
Well, everybody's sort of shocked. People that haven't been to church because of the hurt that took place in that breakup in 10, 11 years are back in church. So many people. People who haven't ever been to church are coming. They're checking this place out. The community has heard about it. They're watching with great interest. Even the newspaper had a big article on it, and and the editor-in-chief of the newspaper has been hanging out at our events and doing things because he's curious. So there's some really, it's been amazing to see the number of people and the generations. We tend to be in a retirement community, but I was counting babies everywhere, and the children's ministry is just packed out. And so young families and there aren't even that many in our community, but they're all showing up because there's a community that's going to help me raise my kids, and the older are committed to really empowering the younger. So it's very exciting.
So are you saying that when we lead the way Jesus led, that it works? It's very, that's funny. It does work.
And what's so fun about it, because you can build a big kingdom on human efforts. It's just as Pharaoh built a huge, beautiful pyramid on the backs of slaves. You can do that. Yeah. But there isn't any joy in it. There isn't any life in it. There's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of, you can go, look at what I've done and look what God has done. Yeah, maybe many people have come to Christ, but just as many people have possibly left the church with the hurt of why they're never going back to church again, because they haven't been listened to. They weren't cared for. They had no voice whatsoever in anything in the church. So I think not only does it work as far as growth, the right kind of growth, healthy growth, but it brings just a spirit of joy and love. And then people around you say, well, look at how they love one another. Instead of look at how flashy they are or how great they are or how powerful they are. It's like, look at how they love one another. And so that's been the joy. I feel loved. I feel safe. I can go in and share my own sins with the elder group, and they encourage me. And, so I just, it's really a joy to be a part of.
Very cool.
Wow. Now, you mentioned, Jonathan, that it was a handful of years of Ryan developing this both in his own heart and life and in his church culture. Could you leave us with just a few practical steps for a church leader, whether it's a church planner trying to set the right DNA in the beginning, or an established church where the leadership is like, hey, we need to move in this direction? What are practical things that they can do? So number one, they read your book. But beyond that, like practical steps to build this kind of culture in your leadership and in your church body.
I do think it's going to be a challenge. Okay. It's whether you're starting it from scratch, whether it's an existing culture, it's a challenge because people are used to church being done one way. When you start developing other people and allowing them to speak and preach, you're going to have, no, we hired you to do that. Sometimes even from your own elders, this is what we hired you to do. It's like, we didn't hire you we hired you to preach. How many weeks are in a year? 52. We hired you to preach 48 of those. So you're going to meet resistance from all kinds of places. And because there's a stereotype, there's an idea of what a pastor is. And so it's a challenge. And sometimes it is helpful. I mean, quite frankly, it's fun because I've gotten to go into different churches that are trying to do this and plant some seeds, talk about the King Saul syndrome, get people to be thinking differently. Because if the congregation stays the same, they sometimes need to be hearing alternatives to what they've grown up with in the church and what they've seen. And sometimes it's easier to have an outside voice. But it does start in the community. It starts in the group of who is leading this church. And it has to be a team that models community. And that modeling of that community is really vital. I remember CJ saying, CJ was one of these guys that says our elder team, he got invited to some pastor's conference somewhere and they went around, do you get accountability from inside the church or outside the church? And every pastor went outside. And it's like, whoa, that's just odd. Here's a community and you have no accountability within it. What's being modeled? Go outside to get it. Well, but anyway, he came to CJ. He goes, oh, my elders. He says, man, if there's even a thought of sin in my life, they can see it on my face when I walk in. What's going on, CJ? And we love each other. We're holding each other accountable. And we're a band of brothers. And then he looked around and he said at everybody's face, and it was like he was speaking Klingon. They didn't get it. They did not understand what he was saying. And I heard that. I go, that's what we need to have as elders. And that's what we've strived to have. That's our language. We're a band of brothers. We've got each other. We're going to help each other grow. And so I really do think that it starts small and it starts building that community that's going to then have multiply itself out from there and really touch the small groups, the pastors, the other people who are serving in the church, or if you're small or big, it needs to be that community modeled that is then it just radiates its way out to the externals. And if it doesn't happen if it does not happen in that community, then it will not happen outside. That's just the way it is. And Paul knows, hey, don't be an elder unless you got your stuff at home in order. See, if it's not being modeled there, it ain't going to come into the church. That was his point. And so that's one of our big messages. That's where you start. You start here. You start in your home. You really model this kind of community, and then that will get the traction that takes the kingdom of God out. So
powerful. Wow. Wait, you want to give a handoff to folks how they can find you, follow what you're doing? Anything else?
If you're a nonprofit, if you're a church, I'd be glad to answer any questions. If you ever want somebody to come in for a day weekend retreat or something to work with, I mean, that's the kind of thing we do. We're supported missionaries, so it's not like we're trying to make a living off of other people's stuff. So sometimes their churches can't afford it. Sometimes missionaries can't. But we love working with the teams and helping a team understand what needs to be done. So, you're free to contact me, Jonathan Spear Martin at gmail.com. And would love to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Jonathan. You've given me personally, and I think our listeners, a lot to think about. And now I'm going to go apologize to my staff.
Well, you have to do that often, actually. So
yeah, totally.
But it really is. Honestly, I would call servant leadership. Here's what I would call it. I would call it our sanctification process as leaders. It's actually growing, and it starts, but it will not end until you die. We have to continue. What does it mean to serve these people best? What does it mean that every person in my congregation has been equipped to fulfill what their role in the Great Commission?
Thanks so much for being with us. And, we hope that those of you who've listened and watched are touched by this, and we hope you keep on leaning in.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.